Perhaps everyone has made mistakes in their youth. When a person grows up, they become aware of these mistakes and change their behavior. However, the main character of this story did not get this chance, at least not immediately. It took decades before he was given this opportunity. On December 4, 1998, Michael Politte was at home in the small town of Hopewell, Missouri, USA. His mother, Rita, was working at a local bar at the time. During her shift, her son was home alone. He got bored and decided to go to the nearest store with the driver. It was a supermarket where he often met his friends. The teenager arrived there and met his 15-year-old friend, George Susi. The student invited his friend to visit him, and the friend agreed. He even decided to spend the night at Michael's and chose his friend's room for this purpose. They played chess and video games while waiting for his mother to return from work. Michael noticed the headlights blinking near the driveway and realized that she had finally come home from work. The teenager vividly remembered that evening, greeted his mother, and she sent the boys to bed. The next thing the high school student could remember was waking up hours later, just before morning, in his room. He was lying on his bed and saw a strange haze seeping through the gap under the door. Something glistened outside. Immediately, he smelled an unpleasant odor he did not recognize but would remember for the rest of his life. It was the smell of fire and death. His friend, who was sleeping on the floor next to Michael's bed, woke up and looked at him anxiously. Michael immediately started calling his mother by name, not understanding what was happening, but no one answered. The tension rose and the children began to panic. When the school children left Michael's room and went to their mother's room, they were literally paralyzed with fear. George and Michael saw human legs with blood sticking to them, and the upper part of the body was burning. Rita was burning from the waist up. The son immediately ran to get water to put out the fire. Called his mother's name, hoping she would answer, but it was too late. At that moment, George ran to the neighbors for help, as the teenagers did not have cell phones. At 6:30 a.m., emergency services arrived. Firefighters started putting out the fire. After the fire was extinguished, teenager called his sister Crystal to deliver the shocking news. When the police arrived at the scene, they found the boy sitting on the bed in shock, refused to stand up, and could not communicate. The terrifying image and the smell of burning flesh were forever etched in his memory. The police officers immediately began to investigate the crime scene. It was obvious that the deceased had suffered a head injury. She had been hit on the head with a blunt object before being set on fire. The fire chief also examined the body and the scene, immediately concluding that the fire had been started with gasoline or a fire starter. The medical examiners thoroughly examined everything, but could not find a murder weapon at the scene. The police immediately suspected that the son had committed the murder and distrusted the teenager. The woman's body was severely burned, and the remains were officially identified only in the forensic lab. The identity of the deceased was confirmed to be Rita Politte. Although he was a schoolboy, he saw cruelty and malice in this murder. True hatred directed against a woman. At the time, Rita was only 40 years old and left behind 2 adult daughters, Crystal and Melanie, who were both in their 20s. The whole family grew up in the town of Hopewell, Missouri, USA, where people were not afraid to leave their property and vehicles on the street. It seemed like a true paradise, untouched by the cruelty and malice of the outside world. Unfortunately, bloody crimes also occur in such places. The local community was shocked by the events, and many people wanted to help find the criminal, which was not in Michael's interest. The environment was so friendly and the crime rate so low that most locals did not even lock their house doors at night. This also applied to the Polittes. Rita left the door open without thinking of the danger, which could explain the lack of signs of forced entry. However, it seemed that the police did not consider other possible suspects and focused all their attention on Michael. Michael's parents met and later married. His father's name was Edward, and his mother's name was Rita. Crystal and Melanie were the firstborn. The girls remembered well how abusive their father was. Their mother loved this man sincerely, but he constantly cheated on her and later began to use moral and physical violence against her. Despite her feelings, Rita could not tolerate such behavior any longer and turned to the police. The family's children repeatedly witnessed conflicts and violence from their father. This subsequently led to behavioral problems in the teenagers, which were most pronounced in Michael. Matt believed that the child's behavior was due to his father's aggression. About a year before the tragedy, the family's relationships deteriorated further. During this time, Michael once saw Edward attacking Rita. He threw his wife to the ground with several blows and then began to strangle her. Michael and his sisters feared for Rita's life at that moment. The children managed to distract the man, and the mother escaped the deadly grip. Naturally, the marriage was doomed from that moment. She began to fear for her life and health seriously. In the summer of 1998, after more than 2 decades of relationship, Rita filed for divorce. Edward wanted to share custody with his ex-wife, but the children did not want to stay with their father. However, Rita did not make the situation or their relationship worse in the divorce filing. She pointed out her husband's infidelity, but did not mention his cruelty and violence against her for years. For this reason, the court decided to split custody between both parents, and the children were now forced to visit their hated father. Michael and George were taken from the scene of the tragedy to the sheriff's office. Although the teenagers were obviously not prepared to deal with the police, the investigators got straight to the point. Already on the way to the police station, a patrol car driver noticed Michael's strange remarks and his lack of emotion. Although his mother's body had not yet been identified, Michael spoke of her in the past tense. Michael was even sure that it was his mother's body, as there was no one else in the house. Despite the fact that the boy might have been in shock and did not know what he was saying, police strengthened their suspicion of his involvement in the tragedy. At the station, Michael was subjected to a voice stress analysis, also known as a voice stress test. After the test, the police officers told the boy that he had failed the test. However, this could also have been due to the child's severe emotional state after seeing his mother's body. Moreover, voice stress tests are controversial, and their results are not definitive and are generally not recognized in court. Additionally, Michael's shoes were taken away. Specially trained dogs found traces of flammable substances on Michael's shoes, which the fire chief assumed were used to set Rita's body on fire after the murder. The perpetrator obviously tried to cover his tracks this way. After being questioned as one of the witnesses to the incident, the investigators immediately turned on Michael and tried to accuse him of murder. However, the teenager and his friend maintained that they had no idea what had happened. They were interrogated without the presence of lawyers. According to the teenagers, they stayed in Michael's room the whole time and did not come out. They were sleeping and did not even hear what was happening. The son of the deceased insisted that he had spent several hours in his bed and only came out when smoke rose in the morning. The teenagers woke up when they smelled the fire and saw the flames through the cracks under the door. However, the police did not believe the teenagers, and the interrogations continued with increased intensity. Both boys were taken into custody. George's mother arrived at the station and supported him as best she could. Michael's father, on the other hand, ignored the need to support his son and did not come to the station. The next day, his sister Crystal, with whom he was very close, arrived. On the second day, Josh gave a statement in front of the camera in the presence of his mother and several investigators. The 15-year-old high school student said he did not know exactly what had happened. Shortly before the fire broke out, he woke up in the middle of the night and did not see his friend in bed. He also admitted that he heard a strange noise but could not figure out what it was. The investigators believed that these statements contradicted Michael's claims, meaning that the teenager had been caught in a lie, which only increased their suspicion. George's statement essentially confirmed the investigators' suspicion that Michael was involved in the murder of his mother. On December 7, 1998, the main suspect, 14-year-old Michael, was arrested on charges of murdering his mother. For the teenager and everyone who knew him, this was a real shock. Michael believed from the beginning that it was a misunderstanding and was sure that he would be declared innocent and released. Therefore, he continued to insist on his words. Although there was no evidence against the boy, this was not enough to change the police officers' minds. The student explained that he would never harm his mother, whom he loved very much, despite all the difficulties and conflicts in their relationship lately. The teenager hoped for comprehensive support. The uncle and aunt, who lived in the neighborhood of the Politte family, indeed supported the boy, as did his sisters. They all believed that the teenager could not have murdered his mother, and that to find the culprit, they should look at the deceased's ex-husband, Edward. Unfortunately, the man had already been excluded from the list of suspects, as he had an alibi. However, there were many witnesses who knew about the problems in the relationship between Michael and his mother. After the divorce, the family went through a difficult time. Financial problems took a toll on the mother and children, and the teenager's difficult transition period added fuel to the fire. Another reason for the police's suspicion was the teenager's character. His behavior was far from exemplary. Michael was in the 7th grade and constantly skipped classes. The teachers believed that he might repeat the year due to behavioral and performance problems. Only 10 months before the tragic event, Michael began to show behavioral issues. Witnesses were found who heard him threaten Rita. These events led to the troubled teenager being taken to a psychiatric clinic to determine the cause of the problems. However, the doctors found nothing and attributed everything to puberty and the stress of his parents' divorce. Later, Michael claimed that threatening his own mother was the biggest mistake of his life. Unfortunately, he was no longer able to apologize and make amends for what he had said. Many troubled teenagers behave similarly, but not all take the wrong path. Michael was not a criminal, did not hang out with bad company, or get into trouble to be considered a suspect. Nevertheless, the police were 100% sure the teenager was guilty, despite his denials and the assurances of all his relatives. Several years passed while Michael awaited a hearing. During all this time, he was imprisoned and considered particularly dangerous, so he could not be released on bail. Shortly before the trial began, the prosecutor offered him a deal to plead guilty to manslaughter. In this case, he could have received a maximum sentence of up to 15 years in prison. However, the teenager refused. Michael continued to insist that he was innocent and should not go to prison for a crime committed by someone else. In his opinion, his father Edward was the only person who could have been so cruel to his mother. However, his words were not taken into account. In January 2002, Michael appeared in court. By this time, he was 17 years old. Prosecution presented the evidence collected during the investigation. First, it was about the shoes on which traces of flammable substances were found, used to set the body on fire. Analyses and tests showed that gasoline had been used. The prosecution insisted that the young man was inclined to arson. Several witnesses had seen him playing with fire for fun and destroying various things. A friend of the accused confirmed that they had used gasoline to set weeds on the railroad tracks on fire just a few hours before Rita returned from work. During the investigation of the crime scene, a canister was found containing some of the flammable substance. The defense attorney argued that the gasoline might have gotten on Michael's shoes while playing with fire, but this did not mean he was involved in setting the house on fire. The defendant did not kill his mother or set her body on fire. From the prosecutor, the jury learned about Michael's behavioral problems and his possible mental illness, which were never confirmed during the interrogation. Nevertheless, his threats against his own mother shortly before her death were considered important evidence of his involvement in the murder. The young man's confidence that he could avoid a prison sentence was crumbling before his eyes. The prosecutor also claimed that Michael had attempted suicide about a month after his imprisonment. It was believed that this was due to the guilt he felt for the massacre of a loved one. One of his cellmates claimed to have heard the accused's confession. However, this juvenile offender was never summoned to confirm his statements. Michael's defense continued to insist on his presumption of innocence. When it was the defense's turn, the young man refused to testify in court, as he could not handle the excitement and keep himself together. This could seriously harm him, as the jurors believed he really had something to hide from them. One of the main pieces of evidence for the prosecution was a video of Josh's statement recorded 3 years earlier. Strangely, the young man himself was not even invited to participate in the trial. Michael's defense was uncertain from the beginning. It seemed that the attorney did not have enough information about his client or did not believe in the student's innocence. The defense relied on the lack of direct evidence from the prosecution, and this was indeed the case. No murder weapon or other serious evidence had been found. Furthermore, no blood or other traces indicating a struggle were found on the accused's clothing. The teenager also did not have any injuries that could indicate a fight with the victim. Prosecution interpreted this as a sign of a sudden attack from behind, which Rita simply had no time to react to. The trial lasted for several days. Then the jurors left the court to deliberate on the verdict. They could not decide for a long time, as the case was highly controversial. It was very difficult to reach a unanimous opinion. The jury found Mike guilty of second-degree murder. However, since he refused to cooperate with the prosecution, the young man received the maximum possible sentence, life imprisonment. Mike was shocked by this development. He accused the court of unjustly convicting him and saw himself as a victim. Nevertheless, he was forced to serve his sentence in a Missouri prison. Of course, no one listened to him anymore. This highly publicized case attracted the attention of several human rights activists who were convinced of Michael's innocence. Unfortunately, teenagers' appeals were rejected, and gradually, the human rights activists lost interest in the case. It is worth noting, the state correctional system is considered extremely harsh. From the first days of his imprisonment, Michael faced the harsh reality of local prisons, which are among the strictest and most dangerous in the United States. According to the young man's confession, he had a fight with his cellmates on the very first day. Moreover, they tried to rape him. He did not feel safe but realized he had to adapt. Otherwise, he would not survive to file an appeal and live outside. The young man was determined to get through this period of his life and continued to insist that he was convicted due to a mistake. He was far removed from prison customs, but quickly concluded that he had to act tougher and rougher and get tattoos like the other inmates. The young man simply wanted to protect his life. Michael repeatedly asked his father for help, but Edward never did anything to assist his son. Only after 10 years of imprisonment did the situation improve. During this time, Michael turned to the human rights organization NRC, which advocates for the rights of wrongfully convicted individuals. The young man's appeal immediately caught the attention of several lawyers who carefully analyzed the case materials. The experts identified several obvious flaws in the work of the investigative authorities and the prosecution. The human rights defenders were convinced that all the controversial statements the young man made after his mother's death were due to his unstable psyche and the shock of what he had witnessed. Furthermore, it was clear that he was still a child at that time. His mother's skull was literally shattered, and a 14-year-old teenager simply did not have the physical capabilities to inflict such an injury on an adult. It also seemed suspicious that Michael's friend Josh could have missed the sounds of the struggle, which meant it simply did not happen. Rita was immediately knocked unconscious by a single blow from someone taller and more mature than a 14-year-old schoolboy. Even the fire chief's belief that the body had been set on fire with gasoline was questioned, as the fire had already been extinguished by the time the rescue team arrived, and the alleged fuel had burned out completely. Prosecution's arguments were based solely on assumptions. Obviously, the detection dogs could not specify what they had perceived. The lawyers even sought to challenge the main piece of evidence from the prosecution, the gasoline traces on the teenager's shoes. According to the defenders, techniques based on the use of chemical reagents were applied during the examination of the shoe soles. It was suggested that this method was not accurate enough, and traces of some polymers used in the manufacture of boots could be identified as gasoline. Later, the state forensic laboratory even agreed with these claims. In fact, solvents and adhesives, which in their composition were very similar to gasoline, were used in the manufacture of Michael's sneakers. However, this information was not widely known in the 1990s. There were only questions about an alleged confession in a juvenile correctional facility reported by one of Michael's cellmates. As it turned out, this was only an ambiguous sentence that everyone who heard it interpreted in their own way. There was also a video of Josh's words. The young man spoke with police officers and journalists on several occasions, both before and after his friend's conviction. He admitted that when he was 15 years old, he was repeatedly interrogated by investigators, each session lasting several hours and being very exhausting. The friend was very scared, and this fear was exploited by the police officers. The investigators clung to every word. As an adult, Josh realized that he had never believed that his friend was involved in his mother's murder, and that he had never claimed such a thing. Even if he had woken up in the middle of the night, and perhaps Michael was not there, it did not mean that the student was killing Rita Politte at that time. Perhaps the friend was on his way to the bathroom at that moment. Finally, Josh stated that he was not sure if he could see the empty bed in the dark, and that Michael might have just been under the blanket. Josh continued sleeping until they were both awakened by the smell of smoke. Josh supported Michael until the end, and believed that his friend was innocent. Unfortunately, the police constructed such a scheme, using out-of-context snippets from the interrogation tapes, making it seem that Josh believed in Michael's guilt. Later, Josh did not confirm his statements and admitted that the interrogators had intimidated him. He was forced to agree to a deal for immunity because he was threatened that he would go to jail with Michael. For this reason, Josh was not present at the trial in person. The prosecution only showed excerpts and recordings of his statements about possible involvement, and the friend himself was not called to court. According to Michael's lawyers, this was because the young man could refute a valuable piece of evidence, the interrogation tape, on which the entire strategy of the prosecutors was built, if the defense attorney spoke to him. Consequently, a team of 3 lawyers was formed who were determined to get Michael out of prison. They collected documents that thoroughly refuted all the prosecutors' claims. Many from the victim's circle believed that the real murderer was Edward, the father of the wrongfully convicted young man. He indeed had a strong motive for the attack. The fact is that after the divorce proceedings, Edward was ordered by the court to pay a high amount of alimony. The ex-wife managed to get him to give up half of his income. Many people confirmed his bad character and abuse of his wife. In fact, Edward's next outburst of anger occurred directly during the divorce proceedings in court. Even the police officers present at the hearing heard him say that Rita would not live to see this money. For some reason, this was ignored during the trial. In fact, the police officers spoke with the victim's ex-husband, Edward Politte, after the murder, but it turned out that he had an alibi, as the man was more than 100 kilometers away from his son and ex-wife at the time of the crime. Witnesses were found who confirmed his statement. After this conversation with the investigators, Edward was cleared of all suspicions. From the beginning, Michael insisted that his father was the only person who could have arranged Rita's murder. The young man believed that he was in cahoots with someone who could have organized the crime. This opinion was shared by the lawyers working on the case. Suspicion fell on Johnny, Edward's brother. Neighbors and the man's wife were questioned. It was discovered that he returned home around 6 a.m. on the day of the murder after being somewhere all night. He never provided a convincing explanation of what had happened during that time. In conversations with neighbors, it was learned that his pickup truck had been seen near the victim's house late in the afternoon. Upon recontacting the man and examining his personal belongings, a tire iron was found that seemed to be the right tool to cause Rita's fatal injury. It was seized for examination and classified as the murder weapon. Despite all this, the prosecution continued to insist on Michael's guilt, who was eventually imprisoned. The lawyers filed an appeal with the court, stating that they could not precisely say who killed Rita Politte. but they were sure it was not Michael, and they attached all the evidence to support their statement. Unfortunately, the state of Missouri is known for its very tough justice system, making it difficult to overturn a verdict or review a case. Therefore, the court began to hinder the defense team's efforts from the start, and the appeal was rejected. The defenders engaged in an unequal fight. At one point, it seemed that the defenders would lose. Suddenly, a decisive event occurred. In 2021, a new law was passed in the state of Missouri, effectively giving juvenile offenders convicted of serious and particularly grave crimes a second chance. Michael and his legal team clung to this opportunity as a lifeline, and it worked. On April 22nd, Michael's sisters Melanie and Crystal brought the whole family to the prison to meet their brother, who was released on parole after 23 years. Upon leaving the prison, the 38-year-old Mike looked up at the sky and thanked his mother, told his family that she had always been there for him and that he had not given up thanks to her. Then, Michael wanted to ride a bike, which had been his favorite pastime before his imprisonment. After his release, Michael moved in with his sister, as he had nowhere else to go. He wanted to forget the decades spent among criminals. He began removing all the tattoos associated with prison, found a job as a carpenter, and obtained the driver's license he had long dreamed of. Michael also met with his old friend Josh, who sincerely apologized for unknowingly contributing to his conviction. Michael understood and said he held no grudge against him. Josh explained that he regretted not falling asleep on the living room couch that night. If the intruder had come through the front door and seen the teenager on the couch, he might have left, and the tragedy not have happened. At the same time, Michael realized that he was still under the watchful eye of law enforcement. In fact, despite the law and the parole, prosecutor had the right to initiate a new trial against the released man at any time. However, he recognized that the police evidence had too many gaps and was solely based on circumstantial evidence, could be challenged. Naturally, such accusations as those against Michael were a significant problem for his reputation. He still hoped that the court would agree to retry the case, as the real murderer was still at large. The lawyers were very careful not to hurt Michael and not to provoke an aggressive stance from the Missouri justice system. Finally, the local sheriff was convinced to reopen the investigation into Rita Politte's murder. Of course, the investigators' attention immediately focused on Edward and his brother. Now, a huge amount of evidence that had been lying dormant for over 2 decades had to be reviewed. The investigators also had access to the victim's car, considered one of the most valuable pieces of evidence. The prosecution agreed with the defense team, and the first successes in Michael's favor emerged. He spent years in prison for a murder he did not commit, and spent decades behind bars until he finally tasted freedom without restriction. He spent most of his life behind bars, and he devoted all his energy to returning to a normal life. It seems that Michael has succeeded. He only has one unresolved issue left: to fully clear his name and ensure justice is served. Michael was also desperately searching for the real murderer of his mother, as he was convinced that it was his own father who had done it. If this is true, Edward Politte framed his son and completely ruined his life while escaping unpunished. The investigation into this crime is not yet complete. Despite the harshness of the local justice system, many law enforcement officers, including the prosecutor, sided with Michael. Therefore, he is confident that the real criminal will eventually be brought to justice sooner or later. The case is still under investigation, the suspect has been identified, and there have already been some successes in this direction. However, the triumph of justice will not bring back the lost decades for Michael. Thank you for watching, and take care.